after telling you about ontology and epistemology, I think it's pretty important to tell you something about hermeneutics. But let me first explain to you why I use this very weird title. It's because of this man, David Silverman. He says in his book on qualitative research, I have lost count of the run-of-the-mill qualitative research papers I've come across which find it necessary to define their work in terms of obscure philosophical positions, such as phenomenology or hermeneutics. You will not find either of these terms in the glossary of this book for one simple reason. In my view, you do not need to understand these terms in order to carry out good qualitative research. Indeed, if you try to understand them, my guess is that you will not emerge from the library for many years. And that's why, Professor David Silverman, that's why we are going to explain to you a little bit about hermeneutics, because otherwise you will spend the rest of your life in library. And I think it is pretty important to know something about hermeneutics. So, how to never emerge from the library again? Well, start reading about hermeneutics. And maybe I can help you a bit by just giving you a starting point. Okay, hermeneutics, where does this term come from? As you will read in any introduction, it comes from Plato, who says that every messenger such as the god Hermes, every messenger has to interpret the message in order to convey a message. So, hermeneutics is about interpreting messages and conveying messages. And Aristotle was the first one who actually wrote about hermeneutics, or perihermeneias. And what he said was, every text has a part that is called the elocutio. It's the text itself. It's the explanation in a text. And after that, you have the interpretation by you, the reader, or by a scholar as a reader. So you have the text as well as an interpretation on top of that text. And then you have the explicatio, the text of the interpreter, which means that you have the text, you have the interpretation of the text, as well as the explication of the interpreter. That's another text, that's another layer. There are 3 translations going on there. And in hermeneutics, we try to look at how do we come to these interpretations in such a way that it's clear, that it's traceable, and that others could have done it as well. An important tradition in hermeneutics is the biblical hermeneutics. As with any holy book, whether it's the Quran, whether it's the Bible, whether it's the Torah, whether other holy books, we need to interpret those books as believers or as scholars. But at least believers need to interpret those books, because often usually these books give guidance in life. So what is this guidance and how do we need to interpret this? And therefore, in these 3 large traditions, but in other religious traditions as well, we have a tradition of how to interpret these texts. And usually this is done on small verses in the larger context of the complete holy text. And one example I would like to stress is Augustine of Hippo, because Augustine of Hippo was an interesting man. He partied and danced and drank for quite some time in his life, and then at one point, while he was sleeping, God called him and asked him to turn his life to religion. And he started focusing on the Bible, started reading the Bible and interpreting the Bible. And he wrote about this in his Confessiones. And what he says is that if you study a holy text, let's make it a little broader than just the Bible. If you study a holy text or a text and you interpret this text, then you have the text itself plus the interpretation. And when you start rereading the text, you have to add up to your interpretation and you have to reread your interpretation. So what you start to do when you follow the hermeneutics of Augustine of Hippo, you have to go to read the text, write your interpretation, reread the text, rewrite your interpretation, read your interpretation, reread the text, and so on and so forth. And while doing that, he suggests you can strive for divine truth. Now, another very famous philosopher, and actually our best philosopher in the Netherlands, Spinoza, who was very famous for his new view of God, totally in contrast to Augustine's ideas, but a very interestingly addition to the hermeneutics, to how to interpret text. Because what did Spinoza said? Well, if you look at text, you do not just interpret the text, so you do not just add another layer. You have to look at the text in its context, and not just the verse, but the verse in its context, and not just in the context of the same book, but probably in the opus of the author, or even broader in a certain period of time. And others after Spinoza said probably within a cultural field, and then probably within a certain language, and then going back again. So from the small verses, go to the text, go to the context, a wider context probably, and then go back again. If we combine the ideas of Augustine with the ideas of Spinoza, what we have is these two very central ideas of the hermeneutic circle. And these are, knowledge cannot be considered independently of the knowing person. So Augustine read the Bible, interpreted the Bible, reread his interpretation. So he played a role in these interpretations. Now that's part one, going back and forth within the knowing person. And second, every person and all knowledge is embedded in a certain context. So in order to understand texts, we have to understand them in a certain context. But what does this have to do with qualitative research? Well, a lot, because we usually look at the world as texts. So even if we've done interviews, even if we did observations, if you imagine them as text, we have an observation with an interpretation within a context in a certain period of time, and what we have is a circle of data, theory within a context.